Hi, fourth graders. This week we are going to read the next story in our theme. And if you think back to what theme 4 is, our theme that we started back a couple weeks ago was called Problem Solvers. So last week we took a little break from our theme and we learned about some more mysteries because we had a shorter week of school. This week we're going to continue on in our theme with story number 2, which is called Marven of the Great North Woods. So if you take a look at the left side of your page in your book, we're on page 414 and 415 right now. You will see the cover of our story, Marven of the Great North Woods. And this story is kind of cool because the setting of this story is a place that is going to be very familiar to all of you. So I'm not going to tell you what it is, but we're going to read about it and you will be able to figure it out. So let's read our story preview page, again, page 414 and 415 in your hardcover reading book. Life in a logging camp. In the early 1900s, northern logging camps were like small communities located deep in the woods. Cutting timber was dangerous work, and for a lumberjack, days were long and hard. Turning an immense tree into neat cords of wood was no simple task. Each lumberjack had his own special job to do, but they all worked as a team. On an average day, a lumberjack awoke before the crack of dawn. Leaving the warm, cozy bunkhouse could be unpleasant, especially on a freezing, snowy day. But the thought of a tasty pancake for breakfast served by the camp cook probably helped. Lumberjacks would then trudge off into a vast landscape of trees. Some days, a woodsman even needed to wear snowshoes to avoid falling waist deep into thick snow. In Marven of the Great North Woods, you will read about a city boy who leaves his familiar home for a strange world of snow, towering trees, and towering lumberjacks. All right, so take a look at the vocab on page 414 in that yellow box that we're used to seeing our vocab words in. I'm sure you noticed all of the highlighted vocabulary words. Here are some of the words that we are going to be working with in our story this week. So we have bunkhouse, cords of wood, we have immense, lumberjack, snowshoes, timber, and woodsman. There's a few more that we're going to be talking about as well. That you'll have to do some practicing with in your packet today. But those are our main vocabulary words. If we read the captions of our pictures, the first picture on page 414 shows camp cooks and fiddlers that are posing before a meal prepared for hungry lumberjacks. Logging camp, this is a picture of a logging camp deep in the woods of Minnesota. And there we go. There is the setting for our story this week, a setting that is very familiar to all of us. And then the last picture down here, Minnesota lumberjacks haul timber in 1900. So today we're going to be reading about a boy who has to leave his family to go live with some lumberjacks in the middle of the Minnesota woods. And why he has to do that is going to be something that's also kind of familiar to us as we're experiencing the COVID pandemic right now. So let's take a look at our vocab and the meanings of each of our words. So we have the word, and just like every week, the definition right across from it. So our first word is immense, which means huge and very large. Now remember, you're going to have to read some of these words in the story, and you need to know what they mean. You're also going to have to do a workbook page with some of these words. So make sure you're paying attention to the words and the definitions. Then we have landscape, which is a stretch of land. Lumberjacks are people who chop down trees. Snowshoes are shoes used to walk across the snow. Timber are trees that can be used as building wood. So when you cut down trees and then they're made into like lumber to build things with. A woodsman is different from a lumberjack. A woodsman is a person who lives or works in a forest. A bunkhouse, which is a building where a group of people will sleep. And cords, and this is cords of wood, are measures for cut stacks of wood. So if you've ever gone camping or you've gone and bought firewood from places, usually they measure, the unit that they use to measure that wood is called a cord. So you would buy a cord of wood, and that's how it would measure how much wood is in your stack of wood. We call them cords. Most of these words are probably familiar to you, because as I said before, the story takes place in Minnesota. This is kind of a Minnesota story. And so I'm sure you've heard these words before, probably almost all of them. They might not be new to you. So it's kind of fun how this fits into our story and our setting in a place that we are very familiar with. So let's get started reading our story. Our story begins On page 400, our story begins on page 416 and 17 in your hardcover reading book, Marven of the Great North Woods. After his great aunt Sadie died of influenza, Marven's mother and father decided to send him away from the city to keep him safe. Marven had heard them talk it over with Uncle Moish and Aunt Geisha one night as he sat hidden on the stairs. Okay, so this is during the influenza pandemic of like 1818. So about 100 years ago, we had another pandemic come through our country, just like the COVID pandemic right now. This was the influenza pandemic, and just like influenza has never gone away, COVID is never going to go away, but we do things to protect ourselves against it, and we learn to live with it. And so what we're experiencing right now with COVID is what these people that live during this time were experiencing with influenza. How will he get along in a logging camp? A boy of 10, all by himself, Dad asked Aunt Geisha. I want him to live to be a man, said Mama quietly. He must go. But Marven's very small for his age, said Uncle Moish. He won't even be able to lift a saw. Marven glowered and huddled closer to the wall. He's got a head for numbers. He'll keep the book, said Papa. Marven knew that he was good at math in school, but a logging camp? I've already talked to my friend Mr. Murray at the camp up north, Papa continued. Marven should go right away. The next day, Marven's mother cut down an old overcoat of Papa's and lined it with scraps of beaver fur. From scraps on scraps, she lined Marven's cap and made ear flaps. Marven turned to his mother. Mama, I don't know how to speak French. You said most of the men who work there are French-Canadian, except for Mr. Murray. You just say bonjour. Bonjour, Marven repeated. It means hello, Mama said. You'll learn the rest, like your father and I did when we came from Russia. Your mother's right, said Papa. Look, we are living proof. When we came here, not a word of English, just Russian and Yiddish. Now look at us. We talk English to all of our children. I talk English to my boss. We sing in English. We make jokes in English. Marven hoped his father wouldn't tell the chicken joke. It was a dumb joke. 2 days later, the morning Marven was to leave, Mama made latkes and knishes. While they were piping hot, she wrapped them in newspaper and put 2 in each of his coat pockets and 1 inside his cap to keep warm. Keep him warm. Don't eat them until they're almost cold, she told him. Then they'll warm you twice. At the train station, Papa handed Marven the skis he had made for his son's 6th birthday. Papa, I've never skied in the country before, Marven said anxiously. You skied in the city up and down every hill in Duluth, and there are many. How far do I have to ski? 5 miles, remember? It's all flat. You'll go like a shot. The train pulled out of the station, and the glass grew foggy with Marven's breath as he said soft goodbyes through the window. Would his family be all right until he came home in the spring? He wished he could take his sisters to the logging camp to keep them safe from the influenza, too. He saw them all there on the platform, Mama, Papa, his 2 big sisters, his 2 little sisters, bundled in their coats, waving. As the train moved away, the little sisters blurred into the big ones. The big sisters blurred into Papa and Mama. They were all one bundle, waving goodbye to him. Marven, alone on the train, going far, far away to the great North Woods. Marven ate his first latke when the train stopped in Floodwood. It was almost cold. An hour passed and Marven ate another latke, then another. Outside, the land stretched white until it reached the trees. The dark band of the forest rested on the horizon as the train sped through the white world of the north. Almost 5 hours later in Bemidji, Minnesota, Marven stood alone on the platform as the train rolled away. Beyond the depot, a road ran straight and flat to where the white landscape met the forest. Marven felt small, very small, and the road looked like it went on forever. He thought of the big waving bundle on the train platform in Duluth. What were they doing now, his sisters, his mother, his father? It was still too cold to stand still. So Marven ate the knish in his cap, slapped his cap back on his head, strapped on his skis, and started for the shadowy thread on the horizon. His father had told him that 5 miles down the road, Mr. Murray, a very big man with a handsome waxed mustache, would be waiting for him. The way was flat and the snow was well packed. Marven thought that if he kept up a good pace, he would reach the camp just after sunset. The thin thread of the forest thickened to a dark ribbon. Soon he could smell the sharp green fragrance of freshly cut timber. And soon after that, he spotted a speck in the distance. The speck grew into a smudge. Before long, the smudge wore a muffler and a fur hat. Remember, 4th graders, a muffler is another word for a scarf. Like he didn't have a muffler from the car around his neck. It's like a scarf. Between the top of the muffler and the bottom of the hat, a huge mustache bristled with frost. Come along, boy, Mr. Murray turned his snowshoes toward the camp at the edge of the forest. I'm like to freeze my derriere off. That's French for bottom. Hello, bottom. Oh, sorry. So Marvin thought, now I know 2 words in French. I can say, hello, bottom. As they entered the camp, the longest shadows Marvin had ever seen stretched across the snow, and he realized with a start that the shadows were the lumberjacks walking in the moonlight. He could smell hay and manure and saw the silhouettes of horses stomping in a snowy corral. From a nearby log building, he heard the lively squeaks of a fiddle. It seemed for a moment as if the horses were keeping time to the music. Mr. Murray must have thought the same. You want to watch the horses dance or the jacks? He laughed. Come along, we'll take a look. When they entered the building, the long shadows from the yard suddenly sprung to life. Marvin stared. Immense men with long beards and wild hair were jumping around to the fiddlers' tunes like a pack of frantic grizzly bears. They were the biggest and wildest men Marvin had ever seen. Marvin could have watched the dancing all night, but Mr. Murray said, Come on, Marvin, we start early in the morning. I'll show you where you'll be living. Mr. Murray took Marvin to the small office where he would work and sleep. In Duluth, Marvin had to share a bedroom with his 2 younger sisters and all of their dolls and toys. But this room was his, all his, and he liked it. A bed with a bear skin on it sat across from a wood stove. Nearby, wood was stacked neatly. The big desk had cubbyholes for papers, envelopes, glue pots, and blotter strips. And on the desk, there were blocks of paper and a big black ledger. There were pencils in a blue glass jar, as well as an inkwell. Marvin hoped that somewhere there was a very good pen, a fountain pen. In addition to keeping the payroll, Mr. Murray said, you have another job. The first bell in the morning is at 4 o'clock, second bell at 4:15, third bell is at 4:20. By 4:25, if any jack is still in the sack, he's in retard, late. So you, son, are the 4th bell. Starting tomorrow, you go into the bunkhouse and wake les en retards. How? You tap them on the shoulder, give them a shake, scream in their ear if you have to. Then Mr. Murray said goodnight, and Marvin was alone again. It seemed to Marvin he had just crawled under the bearskin when he heard the first bell. The fire was out and the room was cold and dark. He lit the kerosene lamp and pulled on his double thick long underwear, 2 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of knickers, and 2 sweaters. Then he put on his cut-down overcoat. After the second bell, Marvin heard the jacks heading toward the eating hall. It was nearly time for his first job. He ran through the cold morning darkness to the bunkhouse, peeked in, and counted 5 huge lumps in the shadows. 5 jacks in the sacks. Marvin waited just inside the door. At the 3rd bell, Marvin was relieved to see 2 jacks climb out of bed. He thought there must be a broche, a Hebrew blessing for something like this. His father knew all sorts of brooches. Waiting for seeing the sunrise, blessings for the first blossom of spring. Was there a brooch for arising a lumberjack? If he said a brooch, maybe all 3 of them would get up on their own. One lump stirred, then another. They grunted, rolled, and climbed out from under the covers. Their huge shadows slid across the ceiling. 1 jack was still in the sack. Marvin took a deep breath, walked bravely over to the bed, reached out and tapped the jack's shoulder. It was like poking a granite boulder. The jack's beard ran right into his long, shaggy hair. Marvin couldn't even find an ear to shout into. He cupped his hands around his mouth and leaned forward. Up! The jack grunted and muttered something in French. Get up! Marvin pleaded. Another jack pulled on his boots, boomed, Levez-toi, Jean-Louis, levez-toi, and shuffled out the door. Levez-toi, Jean-Louis, levez-toi, Marvin repeated. Jean-Louis opened one eye. It glittered like a blue star beneath his thick, black eyebrow. He squinted as if trying to make out the shape in front of him, then blinked and sat up. Bonjour, Marvin whispered. Que es-tu? Quel est ton nom? I don't speak French, just bonjour, derrière, and levez-toi. That's all, no more. The man opened his eyes wide now. So what's your name? Marvin. Ah, Marvin, Jean-Louise repeated as if tasting the sound of his name. Will you get up? Marvin asked anxiously. Jean-Louise growled and fixed him in the hard blue squint of one eye. Please? Marvin stood straight and tried not to tremble. Jean-Louis grunted and swung his feet from beneath the covers. They were as big as skillets, and one of his huge toenails was bruised black and blue. Marvin tried not to stare. Marvin and Jean-Louise were the last to arrive at the breakfast table. The only sounds were those of chewing and the clink of forks and knives against the plates. At each place there were 3 stacks of flapjacks, 1 big steak, 8 strips of bacon, and a bowl of oatmeal. In the middle of the table were bowls of potatoes and beans with molasses, platters with pies and cakes, and blue jugs filled with tea, coffee, and milk. Marvin stared at the food in dismay. It's not kosher, he thought. In Marvin's house, it was against ancient Jewish law to eat dairy products and meat together. And never, ever did a Jew eat bacon. Marvin came to a quick decision. One day he would eat the flapjacks and oatmeal with milk. The next day he would eat the steak and the oatmeal without milk, and never the bacon. After breakfast, as they did every morning, the Jacks went to the tool house to get their saws and axes. Then, wearing snowshoes and pulling huge sleds piled with equipment, they made their way into the great woods where they would work all day. Marvin went directly to his office after breakfast. Mr. Murray was already there, setting out Marvin's work. A fresh pot of ink was thawing in a bowl of hot water on the wood stove. There were 2 boxes on the desk filled with scraps of paper. Cord chits, Mr. Murray said. The Jacks are paid according to the number of cords they cut in a pay period. 2 weeks. You figure it out. I'm no good as a bookkeeper and have enough other things to do around here. Each chit should have the Jack's name, or if he can't write, his symbol. His symbol? Marvin asked weakly. Yes, Jean Louise is a thumbprint. Here's one. He held up a small piece of paper with a thumbprint on it the size of a baby's fist. Marvin blinked. It was all very confusing. Sometimes 2 names were on one chit. These were called doublies. They were even some triplies. This meant more calculations, and sometimes chits were in the wrong pay period box. Marvin sat staring at the scraps. There is no system, he muttered. Where to begin? His mother always made a list when she had many things to do, so first Marvin listed the Jack's name alphabetically and noted the proper symbol for those who could not write. Then he listed the dates of a single pay period, coded each chit with the dates, and with a ruler made a chart. By the end of the morning, Marvin had a system and knew the name or symbol for each man. There were many chits with the huge thumbprint of Jean Louise. Every day, Marvin worked until midday when he went to the cookhouse and ate baked beans and 2 kinds of pie with Mr. Murray and the cook. After lunch, he returned to his office and worked until the Jacks returned from the forest for supper. By Friday of the second week, Marvin had learned his job so well that he finished early. He had not been on his skis since he had arrived at camp. Every day the routine was simply meals and work, and Marvin kept to his office and away from the lumberjacks as much as he could. But today he wanted to explore, so he put on his skis and followed the sled paths into the woods. He glided forward, his skis making soft whisking sounds in the snow. This certainly was different from city skiing in Duluth, where he would dodge the ragman's cart or the milkman's wagon, where the sky was notched with chimney pots belching smoke, or the snow turned sooty as soon as it fell. Here in the great north woods, all was still and white. Beads of ice glistened on bare branches like jewels. The frosted needles of pine and spruce pricked the eggshell sky, and a ghostly moon began to climb over the treetops. Marvin came upon a frozen lake covered with snow, which lay in a circle of tall trees like a bowl of sugar. He skimmed out across it on his skis, his cheeks stinging in the cold air, and stopped in the middle to listen to the quietness. And then Marvin heard a deep, low growl. At the edge of the lake, a shower of snow fell from a pine. A grizzly bear? Marvin gripped his ski poles. A grizzly awake in the winter? What would he do if a bear came after him? Where could he hide? Could he out-ski a grizzly? Marvin began to tremble, but he knew that he must remain still, very still. Maybe, Marvin thought desperately, the grizzly would think he was a small tree growing in the middle of the lake. He tried very hard to look like a tree. But concentrating on being a tree was difficult because Marvin kept thinking of the bundle on the train platform. His mother, his father, his 2 big sisters, his 2 little sisters. He belonged in Duluth with them, not in the middle of this great north woods with a grizzly. The hot tears streaming down his cheeks turned cold, then froze. When another tree showered snow, Marvin, startled, shot out across the lake. As he reached the shore, a huge shadow slid from behind the trees. The breath froze in Marvin's throat. In the thick purple shadows, he saw a blue twinkle. Ah, Marvin, Jean Louise had a glistening axe in one hand. He looked taller than ever. I marked the tree for cutting next season. He stepped closer to the trunk and swung the axe hard. Snow showered at Marvin's feet. Mon petite, you cry? Jean Louise took off his glove and rubbed his huge thumb down Marvin's cheek. You miss your mama, your papa? Marvin nodded silently. Jean Louise, he whispered. The huge lumberjack bent closer. I thought you were a grizzly bear. You what? Jean Louise gasped. You think I was a grizzly? And then Jean Louise began to laugh as he roared. More snow fell from the tree, for his laugh was as powerful as the axe. As they made their way back to the sled paths, Marvin heard a French song drifting through the woods. The other Jacks came down the path, their saws and axes slung across their shoulders, and Marvin and Jean Louise joined them. Evening shadows fell through the trees, and as Marvin skied alongside the huge men, he hummed the tune they were singing. On one day followed the next. Every morning in that time when the night had worn thin, but the day had not yet dawned, Marvin shouted, "Up, lève-toi," to Jean Louise. Together they would go to the dining hall, where one day Marvin would eat steak and oatmeal without milk. The next day he would eat oatmeal with milk and flapjacks, but no steak. Jean Louise always ate the bacon and anything else Marvin left. And every afternoon after that, Marvin would finish his work well before sunset and ski into the woods. Although the worry that his family might catch the terrible sickness nagged at him constantly, when he was in the woods, his fear grew dim in the silence and shadows of the winter forest. And every day he would fall in beside Jean Louis, as the Jacks returned to camp, and he would hum the French songs that Jean Louis had told him were about a beautiful woman in the far, far north, or a lonely bear in its den, or a lovely maiden named Go with Clouds. At night, after supper was done, Marvin learned the lumberjack songs and how to play their games, the ones he could manage, like axe throwing. A jack would have an axe from 30 paces at the tail end of a log. For Marvin, they moved the mark up 10 feet. The Jacks challenged each other to barrel lifting and bucksaw contests, but Marvin was too small for those. He was not, however, too small to dance. Sometimes he danced on the floor, and sometimes Jean Louis lifted him up, and Marvin did a little two-step right there in his stocking feet on the shoulders of the big lumberjack. In April, 4 months after Marvin had arrived at the camp, the snow began to melt. Mr. Murray said to Marvin, "I promised your parents I'd send you back while there was still enough snow for you to ski on. Every day it grows warmer. You better go before you have to swim out of here. I'll send your parents a letter saying you're coming home, but I don't know what I'll do for a bookkeeper." So it was planned that Marvin would leave on the last day of the month. When the day came, he went to the bunkhouse to find Jean Louis. "Ah, Marvin," Jean Louis tasted Marvin's name as he had the first time he had ever said it, as if it were the most delicious French pastry in the world. "I have something for you, mon petit." He got up and opened the chest at the end of his bed. "You are a woodsman now," he said, and handed Marvin a brand new axe. The head was sharp and glinting. The handle glistened like dark honey. "Merci, Jean Louis. Merci beaucoup," Marvin whispered. Jean Louis went with Marvin all the way to the train station. When the snow ran out on the banks of a muddy creek near the depot, he turned to Marvin, grinned widely, and said, "Up, lève-toi, Marvin." The giant of a man swung the small boy onto his shoulders, skis and all, and carried him across to the opposite bank. As the train pulled away, Marvin waved at Jean Louise through the window, which had become foggy with his breath. "Au revoir," he murmured. "Au revoir, Jean Louise." Marvin sat alone on the train and thought of his family. Who would be waiting for him at the station? He felt the edges of his new axe. It was so sharp, so bright, but it was good only for cutting wood. What could it do against the terrible flu that had sent him away? With each mile, the land slid out from under its snowy cover. When the train finally pulled into the station in Duluth, Marvin pressed his face against the window, the glass fogging as he searched the crowd on the platform. When Marvin stepped down from the train, he was still searching. Everyone looked pale and winter-worn, and not a single face was familiar. Then suddenly, he was being smothered with kisses and hugs. His little sisters were grabbing him around his waist. His big sisters were kissing his ears. And then all of them tumbled into Mama's and Papa's arms, and they were one big hugging bundle. "You're not dead," Marvin said. His sisters, Mama, Papa, Aunt Geisha, and Uncle Moish, crowded around him in a tight circle. He turned slowly to look at each face. "Nobody is dead," Marvin repeated softly. "The sickness is over," said Mama, "and you're finally home." This last page of our story is kind of a bonus page from our author that talks about how her grandpa was actually Marvin, who she wrote this story about. So let's take a look at page 442. A note from the author. Marvin Lasky was born in 1907 in Duluth, Minnesota. He was the first child born in America to Ida and Joseph Lasky, who had immigrated from Tsarist Russia to escape the persecution of Jews. The story of their escape in 1900 was told in my novel, The Night Journey. In 1918, an influenza epidemic swept through the United States. The disease was the worst in the cities among large populations. Old people and young children were the most vulnerable. Ida and Joseph believed that they might save at least one of their children if they could arrange for that child to go far from the city. Marvin was not chosen because he was loved the most. Joseph and Ida loved all of their children. Girls in that era, however, were never permitted to travel far from home by themselves, and the last place a girl would ever be sent was to a logging camp. Marven, therefore, was sent by himself on a train to a logging camp in the great north woods of Minnesota. Marven Lasky, my father, is now more than 90 years old. The last time he skied was at age 83 in Aspen, Colorado. He still has a good head for figures.